Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Hourlings podcast. I'm your pinch hit host, Jeffrey Jacobs, and today we're going to be talking about alternate worlds in our world building history. World building topics. And today I'm going to be leading us off with this topic because this topic is near and dear to me. Of course, I write time travel, but time travel sort of dovetails with alternate worlds because sometimes you change the past and it changes the future or it changes the present. And that is a way you can get alternate worlds, but that's not the only way. And obviously, that is what we're going to talk about. What happens when you change that world? When you slip sideways in time and create the world that you didn't expect? So first, I'd like to ask, how would an alternate reality, how would an alternate Earth differ from our Earth?
Well, first of all, I'm going to clarify. I think there's two ways to come up with an alternate world. The first and probably most common is to pick some way in which the alternate world has branched off of our current timeline and run with the football and see where you end up. And the other way is to go, I want to create a world with humans and empires and all kinds of history, but I don't want to have to do research, so I'm going to create my own.
Right. Right.
Game of Thrones is probably a good example of that.
Mm-hmm.
So the first example would be like, I think you mentioned before we started, like if the South had won the Civil War.
Yeah, Harry wrote a book called the Guns of the South, in which the South won the Civil War.
Right.
And it's a very good book, and you know there's a lot of thought-provoking things in the book, but given the premise, you know, you try to make things flow reasonably and as accurately as possible, as plausibly as possible.
Take some research.
Change happens, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's definitely some history involved in that kind of alternate world.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a game too, because it's like one of the things you judge when you read a book like that is, well, how well did the author do? How plausible is this alternate history? And it could be a terrifying new history for the United States. Harry Turtledove has done a lot of good alternate fiction.
I believe it did. Japan won the war as well in some of his books.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's most prolific, probably the most prolific of any of the alternate Earths in this particular genre of changing one aspect of history to arrive at the new Earth.
And he's
of course,
a professor.
Yeah. Now there's of course the alternate where maybe, on that Earth, the Earth that is nothing like ours, vampires exist, or magic exists, or werewolves exist, or maybe people weren't born because they never were born because dinosaurs existed. Something like that.
Harry Harrison did a book like that called West of Eden. And dinosaurs never died out because a meteorite never struck the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
However, humans still rose on this other continent. And as I recall, I believe they were enslaved by the future. The dinosaurs themselves developed an entire intelligent species that used the humans as slaves. And there's I think it was 3 books ultimately.
Wow.
So there's a pretty outstanding branching point right there.
But I believe that you can have an alternate world branch off from our current world without it playing too heavily into the plot, I think. I hate to inundate our listeners with examples. It's a little bit hard in this episode. We kind of have to give examples. But there's a great Disney movie called Big Hero 6. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it takes place in what looks like San Francisco to us, but it's renamed something Japanese. And there's a lot of intermixing of American and Japanese names and racial groupings. You notice that throughout the city, everything is written in English and Japanese. There's definitely a culture of robotics and machinery that you would imagine might come from the Japan that we know today, which is very interested in that. So, that's an example where you can kind of assume what happened in this world, that maybe a long time ago, Japan won World War II or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is recognizable, but you see it just in the setting. But other than that, other than the atmosphere, which is very interesting and colorful and neon, other than that atmosphere, that type of alternative timeline doesn't play into the story at all. It's just
Right.
an interesting setting. And I've written a short story, the same idea, where Japan, won the war and has really brought the Japanese culture to America. You see the intermingling, and it had nothing to do really, other than that. So you can do it without having your plot be totally centered on the alternate history. You can do it just to have an atmosphere.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll agree with that. You can also see it, I think, in some of the better urban fantasies, where I think Charlene Harris with her True Blood series is a pretty good example. But that encompasses not just the True Blood books, but also some of her other series as well, where vampires and werewolves and such coexist with humans, but there's other factors that make the world plausible. For instance, vampires can get along with humans because of the existence of true blood, which is a blood substitute, things like that. And so she adds a bunch of plausible world building details on to make her world seem consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like a whole community that has now surfaced. And urban fantasies are more concerned about the adventures that their protagonists are going on than about any more of, you don't really learn any more about the world as a whole other than what you need to know for the story, because that's what the stories are focused on, adventure and crime solving and things like that.
I mean, I will say that, a good example of urban fantasy that, or even one thing that I wrote once was zombies that fight the Roman soldiers. It's, wow, zombies in ancient Rome. Who'd have thought? But why not? Because you can do alternate things like that when you just play with the rules. But just quickly, another possibility is something that I'm planning to write is, what if instead of Japan winning the war, what if China defeated Japan before they even bombed Pearl Harbor? That China became the superpower way back in the 1930s to essentially then be the dominant power, not Russia, not the US even. What kind of world would that create?
You'd have to branch back you'd have to branch off history a little earlier for China to develop to the necessary level.
Well, I mean, all you really need is give the Chinese AK-47s when the Japanese try to invade in the 1930s.
Jeffrey's answer. Jeffrey's answer for creating any alternate worlds is just give them AK-47s.
I'm just stealing from Turtle Dove. That's all I'm doing.
Yes, give the indigenous people the AK-47s. Just make it all happen. That's funny.
Yeah. Work for Turtle Dove, it'll work for me. No, that's not technically how I would do it, but it doesn't matter.
So David, I'm sorry.
No, I'm done.
Okay, so David divided alternate worlds into two categories, basically. So first, the one where you branch off from the current timeline that we know and imagine what would have happened if something different occurred. And the second being, you just create your own world without any ties to our history, with your own history, with your own mythology, your own religion, all that stuff. I'm going to divide that once again. Mitosis. I'm dividing that second one where you just create your own world into two. I would say that first, you can do that without changing the laws of physics or the laws that we know today, without changing races, without changing, races would have to be changed as far as what you call them, but you could have everything be pretty much the same as what it is, what we know, but just different history. You don't need to make there be different, orcs and elves and whatever. One example I would say would be like Game of Thrones, where that's a very recognizable world. It's very, obviously they have dragons, but as far as like the topography, Westeros, that's Europe. The Mongols, that is the Dothraki. So take away the dragons and the White Walker. Maybe that was a bad example, but you know what I mean. So you have a very recognizable topography. So you can have that kind of world. The other alternative to making your own world would be to change a law. And I think I might have mentioned this before, where like one of my first fantasy novels, the law I changed, which seems like it's just a very specific, simple one, is that I said, okay, in my world, fire will not exist. Then there's no such thing as fire. For some reason, science just doesn't work that way. There's no fire. So how would that change everything else? So I think that's a very useful tool to making an alternate world. Changing a little feature that might seem like it's insignificant or not a very big deal, but imagining the domino effect of what would happen if you were to do that. So those are my two ways to do that. Sorry for doing Game of Thrones. That was a weird example.
S.M. Sterling did a series called the Ember verse series, in which the change came. It's not alternate history per se, but essentially the change came over the world, and the laws changed. Nobody knows why, and fire no longer works, which means you also don't get things like guns,
armor, yeah,
right,
et cetera, et cetera. And it basically takes the world right back to the medieval level.
So yeah, so think about if you're creating alternate worlds, think about doing that, changing one little thing, or you could decide to just not and have it be very similar.
In my case, I chose in my Thousand Kingdoms series that magic works. That's really the only thing that I changed. I mean, it's the second world, so I have my own kingdoms and empires and stuff.
But that's the only law that you changed.
Right. But what happens in the series is it ends up being kind of what I'd call post-medieval, but not modern.
Not Renaissance.
Yeah, because what happens is if you have magic, and you have powerful magicians, they can do what they want, and there's no reason to have an industrial revolution because the people who have the power don't care.
But I wonder if there would be a reason to have the Enlightenment, like medical advances. I wonder how magic would affect that.
They had medical knowledge because they have healers, and healers sort of intrinsically learn about things like infections and diseases and stuff like that.
Right.
So their medical knowledge is high, but as far as the Industrial Revolution, it never happened. As far as the scientific revolution, that never happened. But it's not medieval. It's more advanced than medieval in some ways, but it's certainly not modern, like our current world. And I had fun with some of these interesting effects.
Yeah.
Right. They have watches, but they don't have mass production.
The watches must be very valuable.
Right. They have magical artifacts, so you can get things that have been, blessed is the wrong word, but turned into magical artifacts. But they're not mass produced, so they're expensive.
Right. Takes a lot of work to imbibe.
Yeah. Now I don't want to talk that much about my world, but that is one example of where I was trying to say, magic exists. What else does it do?
Right.
And the answer is it enables some things and caused other things.
The Worst Witch or Harry Potter. I mean, both of those are just magic in our modern world. And then there's the whole set of vampires, as we talked about with Suki and True Blood. I mean, you have these things that are mythological living in our modern world, or Game of Thrones with dragons. So, fascinating topic indeed. But I always think it's fascinating when you do go with it is our world, to think about what is the trigger that would cause this world. I mean, we talked a little bit about the Japanese winning the war, or the South winning the Civil War and forming another country, or of course the famous stepping on a butterfly and in the Jurassic, and basically everything changes. What type of worlds would those create for you guys? What type of changes would you guys like to do?
What kind of triggers you mean? Like what causes it?
Yeah.
I mean, we joked about it, but yeah, a sudden appearance of technology that wasn't there before would definitely have, impacts in wars. So if you're interested in changing the effects of the outcomes of a war and how that would play out in your world, then yeah, I think technology is a good route to go. you could also go like a highly emotional route. Like maybe Hitler fell in love with an artist and they both painted their way through, the Swiss Alps. Nothing.
Right.
I think some other things though, you can have some fun. Let's say in the United States, I think what we signed first was the Articles of Confederation,
Right.
something like that, and the Constitution didn't come until later. So, and the Constitution is what gave the federal government stronger powers, which have steadily increased in some ways over time.
Right.
So what if the Constitution was never signed? What if we were just left with the Articles of Confederation?
Right.
What if every state was basically a sovereign power?
Right.
And
printing its own money and having exchanges between Georgia and Virginia and all that.
The whole concept of manifest destiny, with the United States stretching across the entire continent and obliterating the various Indian nations, would that have happened or would that not have happened?
No, that makes me think, though, David, that some of these changes are easier to run with than others. Some would take a lot of explanation as to why one never came about, like why the Constitution, 50 years later never happened. So there are some easy ones, I think. Like, I think it'd be pretty easy to just imagine a different life trajectory for Hitler, because, that can just happen. You can make a decision and change your life. It's harder to explain things. I mean, I'm not saying it's less interesting. It's actually maybe even more interesting. But I'm just warning our listeners that it would take more research and more logic to explain why this is.
Your story could take place years later in a balkanized continent with lots of small little kingdoms called states and Indian nations. And all you have to say in terms of world building is the founders were unable to come to an agreement on.
Yeah, but why wouldn't that have revisited?
After the unfortunate the death of Thomas Jefferson when he was run over by a wagon.
Yeah.
I don't know. We don't need to debate this, but I still think it'd be hard to imagine that another great man wouldn't have risen up and proposed something similar. Because I mean, nowadays, every nation but 3, I think, has adopted a constitution. So that would be a hard one.
Sure.
I think.
But there are constitutions that are oftentimes based on ours.
Yeah.
The United States Constitution. So somebody had to be first.
Or the Déclaration des Droits des Hommes, the French Constitution.
I don't think it's as painfully obvious and likely as you think it was. And yes, I think the death of somebody like Thomas Jefferson could have thrown the spanner in the works, and we could have had something different, or not at all.
Maybe I'm underestimating the miracle that is the Constitution.
Another alternative is, what if Robespierre, he was killed before the French Revolution? What if the French the royal military killed him before he ever got a chance to cause the terror? Would someone else have caused the terror, or would the French Republic have stood as the first republic, and Napoleon would have never had the rabble roused to form his army? I mean, how much did
maybe isn't relevant to the podcast, but I think someone would have. Same with my stance on the Constitution. I guess that means I'm more of a great opportunity versus great man believer. They always say, like, are there great men or are there great opportunities? I guess I'm looking at things very situationally and thinking, but the opportunity is rife for a constitution to be written. So why wouldn't a great writer have come and replaced Thomas Jefferson, or whatever? Right. So maybe I'm just more in that camp than I thought I was about.
Well, you're sort of. I mean, that
all about timing.
We're thinking about the worst case, but I'm thinking about maybe a better case. Someone kills Robespierre, and you don't have the terror. You have a very stable France under its first republic that is prosperous and good and doesn't cause the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, that could be a history that people prefer.
Or Napoleon decides not to invade Russia.
Or he doesn't go there.
And therefore succeeds and is never ousted by Europe.
Or, for that matter, Hitler never decides to invade Russia. Or, for that matter, the Swedes never decide to, because every time they do.
And the bottom line is, we don't have to actually outline all the different possibilities. So the point is, with all of history,
with possibilities,
you can figure out how to alternate in ways that will benefit your story. which is one of the fascinating aspects of it. It's kind of like a game you can play with your readers. Look what I changed. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Now look what you get. Aren't you glad you're living in our world and not that world?
Right.
Right.
Which Philip
Because
K.
worlds
Dick.
created by authors usually contain the kind of problems that you wouldn't want to have to go through yourself.
Right. I mean, Philip K. Dick, quintessential Man in the High Castle. He's one of the most beloved.
Well, and that's another aspect we haven't touched on. There are also stories written about people who cross between alternate worlds.
Absolutely.
So, for instance,
Go sideways.
if you were the first world to discover that alternate worlds existed, well, gosh, you know those Shakespeare plays that were never found? Just go to a nearby alternate and see if they survived to modern day in that other world.
Absolutely.
Or running out of oil? Oh, just find an alternate Earth that doesn't have people and go drill all the oil you want. And suddenly you have a society that is harvesting the alternate timelines.
Right.
Speaking of multiverse, I have a question that isn't strictly related to book writing, but could be interesting to discuss anyway. I remember reading one time someone saying that when they were bereaved or just really feeling down about the world, it made them feel better to know that in some other multiverse, there was a version of themselves that was totally happy because everything bad that had happened to them in that universe had not happened to them. And so I was thinking, man, okay, so I guess, is there really a Shay out there in some universe or some alternate world where my brother never died and people never broke my heart and maybe I was able-bodied, is that so if that is true,
well, Shay, I've got some good news.
I don't think it comforts me.
No, well, I mean,
does it comfort you?
Here's the thing. If the universe is truly infinite, then everything that is possible is possible. Therefore, there will be an infinite number of me saying that the universe is infinite, and there'll be an infinite number of me not saying that.
But is it comforting that you're not in that multiverse? You're in this one. So.
Well, it's comforting to me to know that somewhere out there's a David Keener who regularly outsells Stephen King, Brandon Sanderson, and Jim Butcher, and George R.R. Martin.
So how are you able to take comfort from
It's
that?
not this world that I live in, unfortunately.
Yeah, how is that comforting when it's not this world? I can't see it as comforting. I see
it kind of goes. It goes into the whole concept between Rimmer and Ace Rimmer in Red Dwarf. If I'm going to go television for a moment, I mean, here is this guy, the Arnold Rimmer, who is just a total screw up. But then he just makes this one change in his own timeline, and he becomes Ace Rimmer, the coolest guy you could ever imagine. Just that one change.
I'm not sure where we go from there.
Not comforting.
Cook me a kipper for breakfast.
But there have been some good stories written about traveling between the alternate timelines for
Absolutely.
a number of various reasons.
Yeah. So what about worlds where maybe technology's advanced farther than it has? We're like in the modern day, except we have intergalactic travel. Or we're in the modern day and it hasn't advanced so much, where, we've kind of talked about no fire. What if no industrial revolution? I mean, worlds like that. I mean, those are also alternates that you can do.
Yeah, I think we've covered some good ground about differences in how technology would affect things. I haven't seen a lot of stories. Maybe I'm not well read in the alternate world topic. I haven't seen many where it's this day and age, like Biden is president and we don't have cell phones or something like that. That would be a different one. I haven't seen many alternate universes like that written.
Now, most of the alternate stories I've seen that do branches tend to branch off of some interesting historical point.
Right.
That has some impact of users, whether JFK survives or doesn't survive. I think Stephen King did one of those.
Yeah.
It's almost a trope now. Hitler wins World War II.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a trope.
Yeah, there are
Of course.
tropes to watch out for.
Lots of other different possible branching.
I mean, one of the classics of the 1960s of Doctor Who was giving atomic bazookas to the Normans, or to the to King Harold Hardrada, to defeat the Normans and keep Britain British instead of Norman, and essentially get Shakespeare on television because he figures.
I don't know what I would do with it, but if I want an atomic bazooka.
Sign me up for one.
It seems like awfully dangerous.
And I know what I do with it.
Hi, I just lobbed my nuclear grenade 100 yards. Am I far enough away? I don't think so.
Oh, I know. You really need a good range on those atomic bazookas. That's for sure. The 60s.
I think there was a time period in science fiction where if you just put the word atomic in front of anything, you could create a story around it.
Right. Yeah.
I've got my atomic toaster.
That's right. The atomic age, 1950s and early 60s. You know, people were all bully about that. And imagine if you didn't split the atom in the 1950s and 40s.
Actually, the funny thing is that some of the older science fiction is actually becoming alternate science fiction. Back to the Future comes to mind.
Oh, yeah.
I think they traveled to what, 2015?
15, yeah. Where's my hoverboard at?
Yeah. I want my Mr. Fusion. Heck with the hoverboard.
Exactly.
Yeah. But there's other stories like that. Even Heinlein was the first author to really create a detailed future history.
Mm-hmm.
But a bunch of his stories were set in like 2000, and we were to the moon and stuff like that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, back in even the 70s, I think they were imagining that by this time we would have so much technology. What happened? But they never, so much of that predicted so many amazing things. But no one ever predicted that we would have a computer in our pocket called a cell phone. Or very few did. I think some did. The communicator, but they didn't imagine it as a pad. By the 80s in Star Trek, we kind of had pads. But
well, everything in Star Trek has come true except for aliens, FTL, and the transporter. Everything else has come true.
And I will say, I mean, let's face it, Motorola phones, they had those flips just because the communicators did.
Of course, I think we've branched off from alternate history now.
Yeah, we have.
We've branched off of a branch. This could go on for a while.
Well, yes,
it's alternate history, yeah. And in another universe, we continue to talk for another hour.
Yeah.
But in this universe,
we're
wrapping up.
It has been indeed another finely structured episode, y'all. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.